Listen to this amazing story of miraculous healing. Enjoy listening. The fluorescent hum of the hospital corridor was a harsh counterpoint to the soft glow of the late afternoon sun, attempting to pierce the frosted window panes. Dr. Eris Thorne, his usually composed features etched with a weariness Amelia recognized as professional empathy, sat opposite her. The air in the small consultation room felt thick, heavy with unspoken pronouncements. Amelia, ever the astute observer, noted the subtle clenching of his jaw, the way his gaze flickered from her face to the sterile white table between them, avoiding direct eye contact for a beat too long. "Amelia," he began, his voice dropping to a lower, more somber register than usual. It was a tone she'd heard countless times in her own practice, the prelude to difficult truths. "The results from the endoscopic biopsy are back." She felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Despite her intellectual readiness to process information, a primal fear, ancient and visceral, stirred within her. For weeks, she had intellectualized the discomfort. The persistent cough, initially dismissed as a seasonal allergy or a mild irritation from a dusty book. The slight difficulty swallowing, at first only noticeable with larger, drier foods, easily attributed to rushing her meals or simply, as she chided herself, not chewing properly. Then came the weight loss, insidious and gradual, explained away as a beneficial side effect of a healthier diet and increased focus on her manuscript, The Autonomous Self, a blueprint for emotional fortitude. Her grandniece Willow, with her artist's intuition and startling directness, had seen through the rationalizations. "Aunt Amelia," she'd said, her brow furrowed with concern, "you're looking skeletal, and that cough isn't going away. Please just get it checked out. For me, if not for yourself." Amelia had scoffed, dismissing it as Willow's perennial overdramatization, but the seed of unease had been planted. Now it was blossoming into dread. Dr. Thorne took a slow, deliberate breath. "It's esophageal adenocarcinoma, Amelia." The words, though clinically precise, hit her with the force of a physical blow. Adenocarcinoma, cancer, of the esophagus, her esophagus. The very pathway that connected her intellect to her sustenance, now a battleground. She felt a bizarre detachment, as if she were observing a case study, not living it. Her training kicked in. Analyze, categorize, understand. "Stage," she managed, her voice surprisingly steady, though she could feel a slight tremor in her hands, carefully clasped in her lap. Dr. Thorne picked up a file, though his eyes remained fixed on her. "Stage 3. The tumor is located at the gastroesophageal junction. It's aggressive, and unfortunately, given its size and location, it's already causing significant obstruction. That's why you've been experiencing such difficulty swallowing, and the rapid weight loss." Rapid weight loss. Not a healthier diet, not increased focus. It was the cancer. The truth, stark and brutal, began to chip away at her carefully constructed facade of control. Stage 3. She knew enough from years of reading medical journals for psychological insights to understand the grim implications of that classification. Late detection, aggressive nature, prognosis grim. The words echoed in the sterile silence of the room, each one a hammer blow to her sense of mastery. She felt a sudden, irrational anger. Anger at her body for betraying her, anger at herself for dismissing the early warning signs, for intellectualizing away genuine illness. She, Amelia Vance, the architect of minds, the champion of self-awareness, had been blindsided by her own biology. The irony was acidic. Dr. Thorne, sensing her internal struggle, continued gently. "We'll need to move quickly. We're looking at a combination of chemotherapy and radiation, potentially followed by surgery, though the latter will depend on the tumor's response to initial treatment. It's going to be a challenging road, Amelia." A challenging road, an understatement of monumental proportions. Her mind, usually a fortress of logic, felt suddenly porous, invaded by images of IV drips, nausea, hair loss, the grim parade of cancer treatments she had only ever encountered in textbooks or as abstract concepts. Her magnum opus, The Autonomous Self, felt suddenly ludicrous, a cruel joke. What autonomy was there in a body consumed by an unseen enemy? She heard a small gasp from behind her. Willow. She'd forgotten Willow was there, hovering anxiously in the doorway, having insisted on accompanying her to the appointment. Amelia hadn't wanted her to come, preferring to face the clinical realities alone. But Willow, with her quiet persistence, had prevailed. Now, seeing Amelia's face, seeing Dr. Thorne's solemn expression, Willow's own face crumpled. Tears welled in her eyes, silent and immediate. "Aunt Amelia?" Willow's voice was a frail whisper, laced with disbelief and sorrow. She stepped forward, reaching out a trembling hand. Amelia felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. She, Amelia Vance, the woman who had always prided herself on emotional detachment, felt a profound ache for her grandniece's pain. It was a pain she had caused, albeit unintentionally, by her own vulnerability. The thought was disorienting. She was usually the one comforting, the one providing intellectual solace. Now she was the one in need, and the realization was terrifying. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The meticulously organized life, the structured routine, the unwavering belief in empirical truth, all of it was suddenly irrelevant in the face of this biological siege. Her pride in her mental acuity, the very foundation of her identity, felt like a hollow shield against the encroaching darkness. The architect of minds was crumbling, and with it, her carefully constructed world. This wasn't a case study. This was her life, dissolving before her very eyes, leaving behind only the cold, hard truth of a devastating diagnosis. The stage was set, not for intellectual discourse, but for a battle she was ill-equipped to fight. For weeks, she had intellectualized the discomfort, filing it under age-related benignities or stress-induced somatic manifestations. Her persistent cough, the occasional difficulty swallowing a rogue piece of steak, these were mere footnotes in the grand narrative of her intellectual triumph, the final chapters of The Autonomous Self, demanding her full, undivided attention. She had, after all, always prided herself on her mental resilience, her ability to compartmentalize and conquer. "Amelia, the biopsy confirmed our suspicions," Dr. Thorne continued, breaking the silence that had stretched taut between them. "It's esophageal adenocarcinoma, stage 3. The words clinical and precise hung in the air like poison darts. Adenocarcinoma. It sounded so foreign, so utterly alien to the meticulously ordered landscape of her body, a body she had always considered a subservient vessel to her formidable mind. Stage the 3rd. She knew enough, from years of casual medical journal perusal and the occasional conversation with physician friends, to understand the grim significance of that number. It wasn't early. It wasn't localized. "The tumor," Dr. Thorne explained, his voice softening with a genuine concern that grated against her intellectual armor, "is at the gastroesophageal junction. It's quite aggressive, and it's already causing significant obstruction. That's why you've been experiencing such difficulty swallowing, and the weight loss, Amelia, it's quite pronounced." Weight loss, yes. She had noticed it, of course. Her tailored blazers hung a little looser, her cheekbones a little sharper in the mirror. She'd attributed it to the heightened metabolic demands of intellectual endeavor, the rigorous schedule of writing and editing. A badge of honor almost, not a harbinger of cellular rebellion. She felt a strange, detached buzzing in her ears. It was as if her conscious mind, the one that processed data and formulated arguments, had suddenly short-circuited. Stage the 3rd, aggressive obstruction. These were not terms that belonged in her carefully curated lexicon of health and vigor. Her book, her legacy, shimmered mockingly at the edge of her thoughts. The blueprint for emotional fortitude. What fortitude was this? Prognosis, she heard herself say. The word flat, almost academic, as if she were discussing a patient's case, not her own. Her voice, usually so resonant and controlled, sounded thin, reedy. Dr. Thorne sighed, a deep, weary exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of countless somber conversations. Given the late detection and the aggressive nature, Amelia, it's grim. We're looking at a challenging road, but we have options. Chemotherapy, radiation, possibly surgery, depending on how you respond. Options. The word echoed hollowly. It wasn't about options. It was about her. Amelia, the unshakable, the autonomous. Her body, the traitor. A sudden, sharp rap on the door startled them both. "Amelia? Dr. Thorne?" It was Willow's voice, laced with an anxious energy Amelia knew all too well. Her grandniece, who had driven her here, waited just outside, a vibrant, chaotic splash of color and concern against the hospital's muted palette. Amelia felt a surge of something akin to irritation. Willow, with her persistent inquiries, her worrying, her very presence, a testament to Amelia's now undeniable vulnerability. She hadn't wanted Willow here. She had wanted to handle this, whatever this was, with the same solitary precision she applied to all challenges. Dr. Thorne glanced at her, a silent question in his eyes. Amelia gave a curt nod. "Come in, Willow," she called, her voice still thin, but regaining a hint of its usual command. Willow entered, her bright artistic scarf a defiant splash against the sterile white. Her eyes, usually sparkling with creative mischief, were wide with apprehension. She took in Amelia's pale face, the doctor's grave expression, and her own breath hitched. "Aunt Amelia? What did he say?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She moved instinctively to Amelia's side, her hand hovering, uncertain whether to touch. Amelia looked at her grandniece, truly looked at her, and saw not just a free spirit, but a deep well of genuine affection and fear. For the first time, the intellectual ice around her heart began to crack. She hadn't just received a diagnosis, she had received a shattering blow to the carefully constructed edifice of her self-sufficiency. And now she realized with a cold, sickening lurch, she was no longer alone in this. Willow was here, witnessing the unraveling. "It's cancer, Willow," Amelia stated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Esophageal, stage 3. She watched Willow's face crumple, the vibrant color draining from her cheeks. A single silent tear traced a path down Willow's cheek, and in that moment, Amelia felt a strange, unfamiliar pang of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. A profound, terrifying vulnerability, not just for herself, but for the impact her brokenness would have on another. The architect of minds felt her own mind, her very being, begin to tremble on the precipice of an abyss. The autonomous self was a fiction, and the truth was a tumor, aggressively devouring her from within. Casual medical journal perusals to understand the grim implications of stage 3. It wasn't a footnote. It was the entire devastating chapter. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of analysis, attempted to engage. Esophageal adenocarcinoma, gastroesophageal junction, difficult swallowing, rapid weight loss, grim prognosis. The logical pathways, usually so clear and direct, seemed to short-circuit, leaving behind a chaotic static. For a fleeting moment, she considered correcting him, asserting that there must be a mistake, a mix-up of lab results, a clerical error. Her body, the one she had so confidently declared a stronghold of autonomy, couldn't possibly harbor such a treacherous invader. Due to its location at the gastroesophageal junction, it's making swallowing increasingly difficult, as you've experienced, Dr. Thorne explained, his voice softening, and it's a significant factor in your rapid weight loss and severe malnutrition. He paused, allowing the clinical terms to sink in. The prognosis, Amelia, is unfortunately grim. The late detection and aggressive nature of this particular type of cancer, it presents a very significant challenge. Grim challenge. These words, stripped of their usual intellectual weight, landed like physical blows. Her throat, already feeling constricted, seemed to close further, a phantom echo of the tumor's physical presence. The meticulously organized world she had constructed, brick by rational brick, felt as if its very foundations had begun to crumble. The thought of the autonomous self, her magnum opus, now seemed a cruel irony, a monument to a delusion. How could she, the architect of emotional fortitude, be so utterly undone by a rogue cluster of cells? Just then, the door creaked open and Willow slipped in, her vibrant presence a splash of color against the sterile white. She had been waiting anxiously in the corridor, unable to shake her apprehension. Her eyes, wide and searching, immediately darted to Amelia's ashen face, then to Dr. Thorne's somber expression. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air, a palpable dread. "Amelia," Willow's voice was a soft, uncertain whisper, laced with immediate knowing. Amelia could only manage a slow, almost imperceptible shake of her head. The words wouldn't form, wouldn't escape the vice grip in her throat. She saw the understanding dawn in Willow's eyes, saw the flush drain from her niece's face, leaving behind a stark paleness. Willow's hand flew to her mouth, a silent, heartbroken gasp. Tears, swift and unbidden, welled in Willow's eyes, tracing paths down her cheeks. It was the first time Amelia had seen such raw, unguarded pain aimed directly at her, and it pierced through her intellectual armor, finding the nascent crack of her own terror. The doctor, observing the silent, agonizing exchange, cleared his throat gently. "Wilhelmina, I'm so sorry. Amelia has been diagnosed with stage 3 esophageal adenocarcinoma." He reiterated the grim prognosis, his words now a distant hum to Amelia, who felt herself drifting, detached from the clinical pronouncements. Willow, despite her shock, instinctively moved to Amelia's side, her hand reaching out, tentative at first, then firm, encompassing Amelia's cold, trembling fingers. Her touch was warm, grounding, a fragile anchor in the sudden tempest. Amelia, who had always prided herself on her self-sufficiency, on never needing to be touched or comforted, found herself clinging to the warmth, a desperate, unconscious plea for connection. The terror, initially intellectual, now cascaded through her, a tidal wave of visceral fear. Not just the fear of death, but the profound, humiliating fear of losing control, of becoming a burden, of her carefully curated image of intellectual mastery dissolving into helpless vulnerability. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the confident, intellectually vibrant woman who had walked into this hospital just hours ago, dismissing symptoms as mere inconveniences. The autonomous self, it seemed, was anything but. It was a fragile construct, now shattered by a single devastating truth. The battle, she knew instinctively, would not be fought in the realm of the mind, but in the brutal, unpredictable landscape of her own failing body. The initial shock of diagnosis had given way to a grim, almost militaristic resolve. Amelia, the architect of minds, would now become the architect of her own survival. She approached the treatment plan with the same meticulous intellect she applied to her psychological theories, devouring medical literature, cross-referencing studies, and interrogating Dr. Thorne with a barrage of precise, informed questions that often left him blinking. What is the exact mechanism of action for 5-FU in inhibiting DNA synthesis in rapidly dividing cells? She'd pressed, her voice still strong, though tinged with a new brittle edge. And how do we mitigate the potential for myelosuppression, given my already compromised nutritional status? She began aggressive chemotherapy and radiation. The first cycle of FOLFOX was a disorienting assault. Within days, the precise clinical terms she'd studied morphed into a brutal, lived reality. The nausea was not just a side effect. It was a relentless, churning sea within her stomach that no antiemetic seemed capable of quieting. Her meticulously organized days dissolved into a haze of fatigue so profound it felt as though her very bones were dissolving. She'd lie on the sofa, too weak to lift her head, the once vibrant colors of her living room muted and oppressive. "Are you hungry, Aunt Amelia?" Willow would ask, her voice a soft, persistent worry. Amelia would simply shake her head, the effort too great for words. The smell of food, even the thought of it, triggered another wave of revulsion. The tumor, a malevolent presence at the junction of her esophagus and stomach, felt like a constant, burning constriction, making the very act of swallowing a terrifying prospect. Each attempt was a gamble, a desperate effort to push liquid past the tightening vice, often ending in painful regurgitation. She clung to the protein shakes Willow painstakingly blended for her, each sip a victory against the relentless erosion of her body. The radiation treatments added another layer of torment. The precise beams, meant to incinerate the cancerous cells, also scorched the healthy ones. Her throat became raw, inflamed, a constant throbbing ache that made even her own saliva feel like sandpaper. Her voice, once clear and resonant, grew hoarse, then a whisper, then barely there at all, and then the hair. She'd known it was coming, read about it, intellectualized it, but watching clumps of her once thick silver hair collect on her pillow, then come out in handfuls in the shower, was a humiliation unlike any she'd ever known. It was a tangible, undeniable mark of her illness, a public declaration of her vulnerability. She began wearing scarves, even indoors, a desperate attempt to maintain a semblance of control over a body that was rapidly betraying her. Her carefully curated world began to shrink. Colleagues' emails went unanswered. Calls from friends were screened and ignored. She found herself retreating, not just from the physical demands of the world, but from the emotional ones. The pity in their voices, the awkward silences, the well-meaning but ultimately hollow platitudes. She couldn't bear them. She had always prided herself on her self-sufficiency, her ability to navigate life's complexities with intellectual rigor. Now she felt like a broken machine, leaking vital fluids, stripped bare of her defenses. Willow, bless her, remained a steadfast presence. She cooked, cleaned, researched, and simply sat with Amelia, often in silence, her quiet empathy a balm Amelia couldn't articulate, but instinctively craved. "You should try some of this broth, Aunt Amelia," she'd coax, holding a spoonful to Amelia's lips. Just a little. Amelia would often turn her head away, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. Her mind, once her greatest ally, had become a tormentor. It replayed the doctor's grim prognosis, analyzed the declining numbers on her blood work, calculated the shrinking odds of survival. She tried to intellectualize her suffering, to frame it within a psychological construct of coping mechanisms and stages of grief. But the raw, visceral reality of her failing body defied all theory. One particularly brutal morning, after a night spent hunched over the toilet, retching nothing but bile, she looked at her reflection in the mirror. A gaunt, ghost-like figure stared back, her eyes sunken, her skin sallow, her scalp visible beneath the thin, straggling wisps of hair. This wasn't the Amelia she knew, the formidable psychologist, the intellectual powerhouse. This was a shrunken, pathetic imitation. The carefully constructed edifice of her autonomous self was crumbling, brick by agonizing brick, under the relentless siege of the disease and its brutal cure. The treatments, meant to save her, felt more like a slow, deliberate demolition. And for the first time, a dark, insidious thought began to take root in the desolate landscape of her mind. What if this is all for nothing? What if I'm just prolonging the inevitable, only adding to the pain? The intellectual control she had so fiercely guarded was slipping, replaced by a profound, terrifying sense of powerlessness. The gauntlet had not loosened its grip. It had tightened, its spikes digging deeper. After weeks of enduring the relentless chemical assault, the promised shrinkage of the tumor remained a cruel mirage. Dr. Thorne, usually so composed, had a new set to his jaw, a more pronounced slump to his shoulders when he delivered the update. "Amelia," he began, his voice devoid of its usual clinical optimism, "the latest scans, they're not what we hoped for. The tumor, it hasn't responded significantly to the current regimen." He spoke of adjusting protocols, of exploring other targeted therapies, but his words were hollow, echoing in the cavernous space of Amelia's despair. She heard the careful phrasing, the euphemisms for failure, for no further options that offer significant hope. The meticulous architect of minds had built theories on the bedrock of logic, but logic offered no solace against a body that had become a battlefield, and a tumor that stubbornly refused to surrender. The initial nausea of chemotherapy had evolved into a constant, gnawing emptiness, a sensation that devoured not just her appetite, but her very will. Swallowing, once an unconscious act, had become an agonizing ordeal. Every attempt to consume even the softest pureed food was met with a searing pain, a sensation like jagged glass scraping down her throat. The tumor, a malevolent presence, had staked its claim at the junction, now a complete blockade. The doctor's words about difficulty swallowing had understated the horror. It was no longer difficulty, it was impossibility. She had lost 25 pounds in the last month, her frame shrinking, her skin now stretched tautly over sharp bones. Her voice, once resonant and authoritative, had dwindled to a raspy whisper, a thin thread of sound that barely carried across the room. Her hair, once a distinguished silver crown, was gone, leaving her scalp pale and vulnerable. She looked at herself in the mirror, a stranger staring back, cadaverous, defeated. This wasn't her. The vibrant Amelia, the intellectual warrior, had been systematically stripped away, piece by agonizing piece. Willow, bless her persistent heart, tried everything. She made nutrient-dense smoothies, pureed soups, even begged Amelia to try tiny sips of water. Each attempt was met with the same grimace of pain, the same futile effort to push through the obstruction, followed by a defeated slump. "It's no use, Willow," Amelia would whisper, her voice barely audible. "It just won't go down." The doctor had suggested a feeding tube, but Amelia, in her heart, knew it would just prolong the inevitable. Her mind, in its final desperate act of intellectual control, began to construct a logical argument for surrender. Why endure more pain, more indignity, for a battle already lost? The prognosis had been grim from the start. Hadn't she, in her own psychological practice, counseled patients facing terminal illness on the importance of dignity in death, of choosing peace over protracted suffering? The thought became a quiet hum in the background of her constant physical agony. This is enough. I've fought. I've endured. Now I just want it to end. One particularly brutal evening, after failing to swallow even a spoonful of thin broth, a wave of profound fatigue washed over her, heavier than any she had experienced before. She lay in bed, the dim light from the hallway casting long, skeletal shadows on the wall. Willow sat vigil by her side, a picture of desperate hope, her eyes red-rimmed but stubbornly dry. "Willow," Amelia rasped, the effort of speaking a Herculean task. Willow leaned closer. "Yes, Aunt Amelia? I can't do this anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The treatments, the pain, it's too much." Willow's breath hitched. "What are you saying?" Amelia closed her eyes, gathering what little strength she had left. "I'm saying, I want to stop. I want to be comfortable. Palliative care." The words tasted like ash, but they were the truth. Her rational mind, the same mind that had built theories of self-sufficiency, now craved only the cessation of suffering. There was no path forward that she could see, only a deepening abyss. Her intellect, her greatest weapon, had failed her. Her body, her erstwhile fortress, had betrayed her. All that remained was a profound, aching desire for peace, for the suffering to finally cease. Willow's hand, cool and trembling, found hers, clinging to it as if to a lifeline in a storm. Amelia felt the unspoken plea in that grip, but she had nothing left to give. The well of her resilience was dry. The words, "It hasn't responded significantly," hung in the sterile air of the consultation room like a death knell. Amelia felt a cold dread seep into her bones, deeper and more chilling than any physical symptom. Her body, once a finely tuned instrument, had become a prison, and her intellect, once her most trusted weapon, was now useless. The carefully constructed intellectual edifice she'd built over 7 decades crumbled within her. Dr. Thorne continued, his voice a low monotone, outlining palliative measures, discussing comfort care. Amelia heard him, but his words seemed to come from a great distance, muffled by the roaring despair in her ears. She looked at Willow, whose face was a mask of grief, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Willow, who had been her steadfast shadow, her fierce advocate, her quiet witness to every indignity and pain. The decision to cease active treatment, to simply endure until the inevitable, felt like a surrender, a betrayal of everything she had ever stood for. But what was the alternative? More agony, more futile hope, for a body that had betrayed her, a disease that clearly held the upper hand. The esophageal tumor, once merely an inconvenience, was now a rampart, blocking not just food, but the very possibility of nourishment, of life itself. Swallowing even a sip of water had become an act of profound courage, each attempt a searing journey down a raw, inflamed tunnel. The pain was unceasing, a dull, aching throb that flared into a fiery agony with the slightest attempt to consume anything. She was reduced to liquid nutrition, a thick, unappetizing formula that tasted of chemicals and defeat, administered through a nasogastric tube that constantly irritated her nostril and throat. But even that recently had become difficult to tolerate, often triggering spasms of excruciating pain. Her already gaunt frame had wasted further, her clothes hanging on her like rags on a scarecrow. Her voice, once clear and authoritative, was now a reedy whisper, a fragile echo of its former power. Amelia, Willow's voice was soft, hesitant, as she sat on the edge of Amelia's hospital bed a few days later. Amelia lay propped up, staring at the ceiling, the IV drip a constant, monotonous hiss beside her. I've been doing some research. Amelia grunted, a sound of weary resignation. Research, Willow? On what? Miracles? The cynicism in her voice was thick, curdled. Willow flinched but pressed on. No, on support. On finding a different kind of strength. She paused, then took a deep breath. There's this group. It's not what you think. It's for people dealing with profound loss. Not just death, but loss of self, loss of hope, and for their caregivers. Amelia turned her head slowly, her eyes narrowed. A therapy group, Willow? For me? You think I, a psychologist of 50 years, need to sit in a circle and discuss my feelings with strangers? Her voice was laced with a venomous disdain. My feelings, Willow, are pain and the overwhelming desire for this to simply end. It's not like that, Willow insisted, her voice gaining a quiet firmness. It's run by someone unconventional. They call him Patch. Patch, Amelia scoffed. A clown, perhaps. Are we to be entertained while we contemplate our demise? He used to be a clown, a therapeutic clown for children in hospitals, Willow explained, unfazed. Now he runs this group. It's at the community center, a few towns over. It's different. Different is not what I need, Willow. I need an answer, a cure. And since neither of those appears forthcoming, I need peace. Not some touchy-feely exercise in group catharsis. Amelia turned back to the ceiling, a clear sign of dismissal. But Willow, for perhaps the first time in their relationship, held her ground. Please, Aunt Amelia, for me. You're not doing anything else. What more do you have to lose? Just one session. If you hate it, we never go again. But please, just try. Her voice cracked with emotion, the raw vulnerability of her plea finally breaking through Amelia's hardened shell. Amelia sighed, a long, shaky breath that seemed to carry the weight of her entire being. The thought of moving, of sitting upright, of enduring any new interaction was abhorrent. But the desperate plea in Willow's eyes, the sheer exhaustion etched on her young face, pulled at something within Amelia she hadn't known was still alive. A tiny spark of obligation, perhaps, or a desperate, illogical shred of curiosity. Fine, Amelia rasped, the word barely audible. One session, and if it's as ridiculous as I imagine, you will never mention it again. Willow's face immediately brightened, a wave of relief washing over her. Thank you, Aunt Amelia. Thank you. The next afternoon, Willow carefully helped Amelia into the car. The short drive felt interminable, each bump in the road a jolt of pain. Amelia's internal monologue was a scathing review of her grandniece's naivety, a reassertion of her own intellectual superiority, and a bitter prediction of the utter futility of this endeavor. They pulled up to a brightly painted community center, a riot of primary colors that clashed violently with Amelia's somber mood. Inside, the room Willow led her to was even worse. Murals of smiling suns and whimsical trees adorned the walls. Mismatched cushions and beanbags littered the floor. There was no clinical precision here, no intellectual order. It felt amateurish, childish. A man perhaps in his late 50s, with a shock of unruly silver hair and eyes that crinkled at the corners approached them. He wasn't wearing a red nose, but there was an undeniable theatricality to his presence, a gentle, almost shimmering energy. He wore a loose, brightly colored tunic and comfortable trousers. "Willow, and this must be Amelia," he said, his voice surprisingly deep and resonant, a soothing balm that cut through Amelia's cynicism. He extended a hand, not for a handshake, but gesturing towards a particularly plush armchair nestled amongst a cluster of cushions. "Welcome. My name is Patch." Amelia eyed him with suspicion, her expression a clear challenge. She settled into the armchair with a sigh that was more a groan of physical discomfort than a social nicety. The chair, surprisingly, was comfortable, cradling her aching body. She looked around at the small group of people already present, a young woman with haunted eyes, an elderly man with a vacant stare, a middle-aged couple holding hands tightly. Patch began to speak, not with the clipped, clinical tones of a therapist, nor the saccharine platitudes of a self-help guru. He spoke in stories, in metaphors, his voice weaving a tapestry of shared human experience. He talked about shadows and light, about the weight of unspoken burdens, about the unexpected strength found in shared vulnerability. Amelia listened, her cynical defenses fully engaged, ready to dissect every word, to find the flaw, the banality, the emotional manipulation. But despite herself, a tiny sliver of her attention was caught. He wasn't telling them what to feel or how to fix it. He was simply acknowledging the darkness, validating the pain. As the session progressed, Patch introduced a quiet art exercise, inviting participants to pick up small, smooth stones and simply hold them, to feel their weight, and then, if they wished, to tell the stone a story without words, a story of something heavy in their heart. Amelia scoffed internally. This was exactly the kind of saccharine nonsense she had anticipated. But then she noticed the young woman with haunted eyes cradling her stone, tears silently tracking down her face, and the elderly man gently tracing patterns on his, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his hand. A grudging curiosity, a flicker of something beyond intellectual disdain, began to stir within Amelia. This was not a quick fix. This was simply presence. And in her world of sterile medical interventions and intellectual pursuits, mere presence was something she had entirely forgotten. "Amelia, this is Patch." Willow's voice was a soft, insistent hum in the brightly painted room. It was a space that screamed defiance at the sterile, hushed tones of hospitals, a riot of primary colors and mismatched, comfortable furniture. Patch, true to Willow's description, was an eccentric vision, a man whose kind eyes crinkled at the corners, framed by a shock of unruly silver hair and a nose that seemed to have been broken once or twice. He wore a vibrant patched waistcoat over a simple white shirt, and his presence radiated a peculiar blend of gentle warmth and quiet authority. Amelia, propped awkwardly in a plush armchair, felt a surge of familiar irritation. This was her grandniece's latest desperate gambit, a foray into what Amelia had mentally categorized as woo-woo nonsense. A support group, led by a former clown? It was an insult to her intellectual rigor, a blatant disregard for her carefully constructed rational world. She had come only because Willow's quiet plea had held a tremor of raw grief that Amelia, in her weakened state, found herself unable to resist. "Welcome, Amelia," Patch said, his voice a low, resonant rumble, utterly devoid of the saccharine cheerfulness she'd braced herself for. "Thank you for joining us." He didn't offer a hand, didn't invade her space, simply offered a small, understanding nod that seemed to bypass her intellectual defenses and go straight to the raw, aching core of her being. The room was filled with about a dozen people. A young woman, her eyes perpetually red-rimmed, clutched a worn teddy bear. An elderly man, his hands gnarled with age, sat silently, staring at a point beyond the wall. Others carried the invisible burdens of illness, loss, and unquantifiable pain. It was a collection of human wreckage, Amelia thought with a pang of self-pity, and she, the formidable Dr. Vance, was now part of it. Patch began the session not with introductions or polite chit-chat, but with a simple instruction. He pulled out a large roll of brown paper, tearing off sheets and handing them to each participant, along with trays of vibrant, chunky paints and brushes. "Today," he announced, his eyes sweeping over the group, "we're going to unburden ourselves, not with words, for words can be clumsy, inadequate things. We're going to paint our unspoken burdens. No rules, no judgments, no right or wrong. Just express." Amelia stared at the blank paper, then at the lurid paint colors. This was absurd. She was a psychologist, a scholar of the mind, not some art therapy dropout. Her fingers, thin and trembling from her illness, felt alien as she picked up a brush. What was her unspoken burden? The terror of death? The humiliation of her body's betrayal? The unbearable lightness of her own intellectual failure in the face of such a primal force? She dipped the brush into a deep, angry crimson. She wanted to paint the searing pain in her throat, the constant, gnawing hunger that was both physical and existential. But as her hand moved, something else emerged. A series of dark, oppressive lines crisscrossing and trapping a small, pale blob in the center. It was herself, she realized with a jolt, trapped, suffocating, a prisoner in her own failing body. And surrounding it, like an invisible cage, was the fear of being a burden. The ultimate irony for a woman who had championed self-reliance. She continued, the brush moving with a surprising fluidity, guided by an emotion she rarely permitted herself to acknowledge. She added layers of muddy brown, representing the shame of her physical deterioration, the loss of her former sharp image. Then a splash of sickly yellow, the bile of her own despair. The painting was ugly, chaotic, and utterly, terrifyingly honest. It was everything she had fought to intellectualize, to keep at arm's length, now splattered onto a sheet of paper for all to see. As she painted, she became aware of the others. The young woman with the teddy bear was swirling vast galaxies of sorrow with blues and purples, her face streaked with tears that blended into the paint. The elderly man, who had been so still, was now meticulously creating a landscape of stark, empty trees under a gray sky. Each stroke deliberate, each bare branch a testament to loss. There was no judgment, no commentary, just the shared rhythmic scratch of brushes on paper. The occasional sigh, the quiet release of pent-up emotion. Amelia found herself watching them, not with her usual clinical detachment, but with a raw, unexpected empathy. She saw the profound grief in the young woman's boundless blue, the quiet dignity in the old man's desolate landscape. They were expressing the unexpressible, giving form to the formless. And in their shared vulnerability, a strange current began to flow, connecting them all. There was no need for words, no need for explanations. The painting spoke a universal language of suffering, of loss, of the deep, often unspoken fears that bind humanity. When Patch gently announced it was time to stop, Amelia felt a surprising pang of disappointment. She wasn't finished, but the act of painting, of externalizing the internal turmoil, had been a strange, cathartic release. She looked at her own chaotic canvas, no longer with shame, but with a dawning sense of recognition. This was her burden. And seeing it, giving it form, somehow lessened its crushing weight. Patch walked around, silently observing each painting, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer platitudes or interpretations, simply acknowledged each person's raw outpouring with a gentle nod. When he reached Amelia's, he paused for a long moment, his gaze soft, understanding. "A profound journey, Amelia," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "The courage to paint the truth. That is where healing begins." Amelia, accustomed to dissecting complex psychological theories, found herself speechless. This simple, unconventional act, this bizarre afternoon, had cracked open something within her that years of intellectual rigor had kept tightly sealed. She had come expecting to dismiss, to mock. Instead, she had found herself, utterly stripped of pretense, in the company of strangers who, through their shared, silent expressions of pain, had shown her a vulnerability she had always equated with weakness. And for the first time in months, she didn't feel quite so alone. The air, which had felt heavy with despair, now carried a faint, almost imperceptible hum of shared humanity, a whisper of connection that resonated deep within her ravaged spirit. The next session, she realized with a jolt, she might actually look forward to. The sterile scent of the hospital room was a stark contrast to the vibrant, earthy smell of the paints Amelia had used just days ago. Days? Weeks? Time had ceased to hold meaning. Her body, once an elegant, self-sufficient vessel, was now a battlefield, ravaged and surrendering. The tumor, a malevolent entity, had tightened its grip, a suffocating fist around her esophagus. Each breath was a shallow, painful gasp, each attempt to swallow a dry, rasping cough. She was tethered to a dozen machines, their rhythmic beeps and whirs the only constant in her fading consciousness. Willow was there, a soft, warm hand clutching hers. Amelia could feel the tremor in her grandniece's fingers, the quiet desperation radiating from her presence. She heard hushed voices, Dr. Thorne's somber pronouncement echoing Willow's earlier, grief-stricken plea. "We've done everything we can, Wilhelmina. It's a matter of hours, perhaps a day at most. The obstruction is almost complete." Amelia was a drifting leaf on a vast, dark current. Her mind, usually a fortress of logic, was dissolving, fragments of thoughts swirling like dust motes in a dying light. She felt the heavy cloak of unconsciousness beginning to settle, a welcome oblivion after weeks of relentless pain. Yet within the deepening shadows, a different sensation began to stir. Not pain, not fear, but a peculiar, luminous warmth. She was no longer in the hospital room. The harsh fluorescent lights were gone, replaced by a soft, diffused glow. She was back in Patch's brightly painted room, the scent of turpentine and old wood tickling her senses. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, yet strangely comforting. She saw the faces of the others from the group, the young woman with the haunted eyes, the stoic elderly man. They weren't looking at her, but at something in the center of the room. Then Patch appeared. He wasn't wearing his patched waistcoat, but a simple flowing white tunic. His eyes, usually crinkling with mirth, were deeply compassionate, holding an ancient wisdom. He moved towards her, his steps silent, his presence radiating an undeniable tranquility. In his hand, he held something small, vibrant, and oddly familiar. He extended his hand, and in his palm lay a fragment. It was a piece of her own abstract painting, the one she'd created in that raw, vulnerable moment. A swirling vortex of deep blues and angry reds, shot through with a tentative, almost imperceptible sliver of gold. It was a visual representation of her unspoken burden, the crushing fear of becoming a burden herself, the lifelong struggle with vulnerability she'd painted onto the canvas. As he placed the small painted fragment into her semi-conscious hand, a jolt, not of electricity, but of pure, unadulterated peace coursed through her. It wasn't a physical sensation, but a deep, resonant knowing. The colors on the fragment seemed to shimmer, the sliver of gold expanding, pushing back the blues and reds. "You are not alone," Patch's voice was a whisper, yet it resonated in every fiber of her being, clear and profound, echoing not just in her ears but in the deepest chambers of her soul. It wasn't just his voice. It was the collective understanding of the room, the silent affirmation of shared struggle, shared humanity. The weight that had pressed down on her for 71 years, the self-imposed burden of self-reliance, began to lift. It was replaced by an encompassing warmth, a sense of belonging she had stubbornly denied herself for so long. The image of the vortex began to shift. The angry reds softened, bleeding into the blues, and the sliver of gold became a radiant, expanding core. It was as if the painting itself was breathing, expanding, transforming. She felt a profound sense of acceptance wash over her, not just of her vulnerability, but of the very interconnectedness of all life. The boundaries of her individual self, so rigidly defined for so long, blurred and dissolved into something vast and compassionate. Then the warmth intensified, focusing like a tiny burning star in her chest, right where the tumor lay. It was not pain, but an incredible, almost unbearable pressure, a silent whisper in her spirit that said, "Let go, trust, you are not alone." The pressure built, then suddenly, infinitesimally, released. A single clear drop of liquid seemed to form in her throat, cool and smooth, sliding effortlessly down. It was just a sensation, a phantom swallow in her dream state, yet it brought with it an overwhelming sense of relief, a whisper of life. The hospital room began to reassert itself around the edges of the vision, the rhythmic beeps of the machines growing louder, more distinct. Willow's hand was still warm in hers, but the tremor was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady presence. Amelia felt herself being pulled back, gently but firmly, from the luminous realm of shared vulnerability to the harsh reality of her failing body. Yet the echo of Patch's voice, the profound sense of not alone, remained, a persistent, tender hum at the core of her being. The phantom swallow, strangely, felt real. The last coherent thought before darkness claimed her was a quiet, almost defiant hope. The sterile scent of the hospital room, a constant companion for days, suddenly seemed less oppressive. Or perhaps it was Amelia's senses, sharpening from the fog of nearing oblivion. The rhythmic beeps of the machines, once a monotonous death knell, now felt different. Less urgent, less insistent? She wasn't sure. A faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air, a whisper of coolness on her parched lips, registered in her fading awareness. Willow slumped in the armchair beside the bed, her face etched with exhaustion and unshed tears, stirred. She hadn't left Amelia's side since Dr. Thorne's grim pronouncement. Her hand, still clasping Amelia's, was now warm, a comforting anchor in the returning tide of consciousness. Amelia's eyes fluttered open, heavy lids struggling to obey. The fluorescent lights overhead were a blinding glare, but through the haze she saw Willow, her grandniece's face a kaleidoscope of fear and love. Amelia attempted to speak, to offer some word of comfort, a final, rational thought, but her throat was a dry, rasping desert, a physical manifestation of the tumor's suffocating embrace. A desperate, guttural sound escaped her lips, a sound of profound thirst. Willow's head shot up. "Amelia, you're awake!" Her voice was a fragile whisper of hope, a stark contrast to the despair of moments before. She pressed the call button, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and nascent disbelief. "Nurse! She's awake!" A nurse, a kind-faced woman named Mary, hurried in, followed quickly by a resident. Their faces, too, mirrored Willow's initial shock. They checked Amelia's vitals, consulted the monitors. The numbers, though still precarious, had stabilized. The alarming drops in oxygen saturation had ceased. The rapid, desperate breaths had eased into a shallower, but more regular rhythm. She's holding her own," the resident murmured, a note of profound confusion in his voice. "Her stats are improving." Amelia, her mind clearing with agonizing slowness, focused on the immediate, overwhelming need, the unbearable dryness in her throat, the memory of the painting, the whisper of, "You are not alone," still resonated within her, a strange, comforting echo. But now it was overlaid with a more primal demand. She managed to croak out a single, almost inaudible word. "Water." Willow leaned in, her ear close to Amelia's lips. "Water? Are you sure, Aunt Amelia?" The doctor said. Her voice trailed off, remembering the absolute and total obstruction. But Amelia's gaze was resolute, a flicker of her old, unyielding determination returning. She needed water, not because her body demanded it, but because a deeper, more profound instinct had awakened. A desire to live, to feel the cool, life-giving liquid, even if it meant excruciating pain. The nurse, after a quick, uncertain glance at the resident, brought a small plastic cup with a few drops of water and a sponge swab. "Just a little, dear, to moisten your lips." Amelia shook her head, a barely perceptible motion. Her eyes, filled with a new, fierce light, locked onto Willow's. "Sip," she rasped, her voice rough but surprisingly clear. "Small sip." Willow, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, dipped a clean spoon into the water. Her hand trembled as she brought it to Amelia's lips. "Just try," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Amelia gathered every ounce of her remaining strength. The spoon touched her lips, and the cold, unyielding liquid met the agonizingly constricted opening of her esophagus. She braced herself for the searing pain, the immediate regurgitation, the choking that always followed. She closed her eyes, willing herself to accept the inevitable. But there was no pain, a tiny, almost imperceptible trickle. Then another. The water miraculously went down. Not easily, not freely, but it went down. A cool, smooth passage, not blocked, not seized. It felt like a small, impossible victory, a whisper of life where only death had been. Amelia opened her eyes, startled. A profound, almost spiritual calm settled over her. The dryness in her throat, though not gone, had eased. She felt a lightness, a sense of burden lifted that went beyond the physical. The nurse in resident, who had been watching with a mixture of apprehension and professional detachment, gasped. The resident immediately grabbed his stethoscope and began to listen. He palpated Amelia's neck, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "This is impossible," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The obstruction was complete. He looked at the nurse, then at Willow, his face a mask of baffled wonder. "Her airway is clear. I can hear some gurgling, but no sign of immediate distress." Dr. Thorne was called, arriving within minutes, his usual stoic demeanor replaced by an expression of utter bewilderment. He examined Amelia meticulously, repeating the resident's observations. Her breathing was steadier, her color was better, and the impossible fact remained: she had swallowed water. "We need an emergency endoscopy," he stated, his voice tight with an unfamiliar blend of apprehension and scientific curiosity, "and a CT scan, immediately." Hours later, the results were in. Dr. Thorne stood at Amelia's bedside, the scans illuminated on a light box behind him. His voice, usually so measured, held a tremor of something akin to awe. "Amelia," he began, his gaze fixed on her, "I don't have a medical explanation for this. The tumor, it's still there, yes, but it has significantly regressed. Not completely by any means, but enough to allow for a partial opening of the esophagus. The inflammation has reduced dramatically. It's a spontaneous remission of sorts. An unexplained response." He shook his head, running a hand through his thinning hair. "In all my years, I've never seen anything quite like it, especially not after the prognosis we had. It's a miracle, Amelia, a genuine medical anomaly." Amelia, still weak but clearer-headed than she had been in weeks, looked at the scans. The dark, menacing mass was undeniably smaller, less aggressive, a grudging retreat from the stranglehold it had maintained. She felt no triumphant pride, no intellectual satisfaction, only a profound, humbling gratitude. She looked at Willow, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Willow, who had clung to hope when Amelia herself had abandoned it. Willow, who had dragged her, kicking and screaming, into the brightly painted room, into the presence of Patch and his unconventional methods. Willow, who had held her hand as she painted her unspoken burden, the fear of vulnerability. The "you are not alone" whispered in her mind again, this time with the full, vibrant force of reality. It wasn't a dream. It was a tangible truth, manifested in the impossible swallow, in the baffled expressions of the doctors, in the quiet, hopeful tears streaming down Willow's face. The whisper of life had become a roaring affirmation. Amelia's eyes fluttered open, heavy lids struggling to obey. The fluorescent lights overhead were a blinding glare, but through the haze she saw Willow, her grandniece's face a kaleidoscope of fear and love. Amelia attempted to speak, to offer some word of comfort, but her throat felt inexplicably, miraculously, open. Not entirely, not perfectly, but the suffocating vice that had clamped down for weeks seemed to have loosened its grip. The constant, searing pain that had been her world had receded, replaced by a dull ache, a mere shadow of its former torment. Willow, startling awake, leaned forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a fragile, nascent hope. "Amelia, are you awake?" Her voice was choked with emotion. Amelia's voice, a raspy whisper for so long, surprised even herself. "Water," she croaked, the single word a monumental effort, yet it was articulated, not merely a gasp. Willow hesitated, her brow furrowed. "The doctors said, they said nothing could get past the obstruction, Aunt Amelia. Not even sips. Her voice trembled, remembering the agonizing attempts just hours before. Please, Amelia managed, a newfound urgency stirring within her. The vivid memory of Patch's face, the vibrant splash of her painting, the profound sense of "you are not alone" still resonated, a warm hum in her chest. It wasn't a dream, it was a truth. And that truth, that connection, it had created a space where there had been none. Willow, seeing the desperate plea in Amelia's eyes, fumbled for the plastic cup with the small straw on the bedside table. Her hand shook as she brought it to Amelia's lips. Amelia took a tentative sip. The coolness touched her tongue, slid down her throat, and then, the impossible. It went down. Not perfectly, a slight catch, but without the agonizing, choking spasm that had been her constant companion. A small, almost imperceptible trickle of liquid entered her parched system. Willow gasped, a silent, tearful sound. Her eyes, fixed on Amelia's throat, widened in disbelief. Another sip, more confident this time. The easing was palpable, a gentle widening of the constricted passage. The nurse, alerted by Willow's sudden movement, bustled in. She saw the cup, the water, and Amelia's eyes, now noticeably clearer, fixed on her. Her professional composure wavered, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. She quickly checked Amelia's vitals, her expression shifting from confusion to stunned realization. The oxygen saturation was up, the heart rate steadier, the shallow, frantic breathing replaced by a slower, more rhythmic pattern. Dr. Thorne was summoned. He entered the room, his face still etched with the weariness of delivering grim news. He approached the bed, his gaze sweeping over the monitors, then fixing on Amelia. He saw the almost empty water cup, the very slight flush of color returning to Amelia's cheeks, the newfound alertness in her eyes. His medical mind, trained in rational diagnosis and predictable outcomes, struggled to compute. "Amelia," he said, his voice laced with disbelief, You swallowed water?" Amelia nodded, a small, weary smile touching her lips. "Yes, doctor. A sip." Dr. Thorne ordered an immediate scan. The medical team moved with a hurried, almost frantic energy, a stark contrast to the somber resignation of hours before. Willow held Amelia's hand throughout the process, her grip tight, her eyes shimmering with tears of a different kind, tears of impossible, overwhelming hope. When the results came, Dr. Thorne stood before them, the scan images on a tablet in his hand. His face, usually so composed, was a mask of professional bafflement. "Amelia," he began, his voice hoarse, "the obstruction, it's significantly reduced. Not gone, not completely, but the tumor has regressed, substantially." He gestured to the screen, pointing to the before and after images. The difference was undeniable, a stark visual testament to the inexplicable. Medically speaking, there's no explanation, no change in treatment, no new medication. This is what we call a spontaneous remission or an unexplained response. It's extraordinary. He looked from Amelia to Willow, then back again, shaking his head slightly, as if trying to dislodge a stubborn, illogical fact. Truly a medical anomaly. Amelia met his gaze, a quiet understanding passing between them. An anomaly to science, perhaps, but to her, it was simply the answer to a different kind of truth. The truth of human connection, of shared vulnerability, of an autonomous heart that had finally learned to beat in rhythm with others. The sterile scent of the hospital room suddenly felt less like a cage and more like a launching pad.